They forgot about it? What do you mean they forgot about it? How do you forget about your own anti-tank ditch? Huh? Vodka. Okay, I'm more of a red wine guy myself, but I still think I'd remember my anti-tank ditch. Uh-huh. Yeah, bye. There is an avalanche of Soviet armor crashing down the hill towards the German panzers. They watch in amazement as several hundred tons of Soviet steel gets closer and closer. If these tanks break through, it could mean the collapse of the entire front and Rotmistrov's victory. But then, the Tigers go hunting. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II in real-time miniseries on the Battle of Prokhorovka. Last time we saw how the Soviets stormed the enemy at Oktyabrski State Farm and on Hill 252.2. On the hill, the avalanche of Soviet armor overwhelmed the German defenders. The Soviets did take very heavy losses, but now their tanks are charging down the reverse slope towards the panzer companies at the bottom. However, they're held up by the Germans at the farm. Meanwhile, in the German rear, a small group of Soviet tanks broke through to Komsomolets State Farm, threatening the division's command posts, communications, and artillery. Okay, the base of Hill 252.2, around 10:30 a.m. The situation here has the potential to be very rough indeed for the Germans. SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte has 2 panzer companies here, as well as loads of anti-tank guns, and they can call in artillery and air support, but it will be a real challenge to stand up to that approaching mass of Soviet armor. It must be an incredible sight, and quite terrifying, as Kirichenko's tanks barrel down the hill, firing on the move. They race down the incline towards the 2 German panzer companies, which opened fire on them from the declivity. Mistaking the German tanks for Tigers, they wanted to eliminate their range superiority as quickly as possible. According to a German eyewitness report, to anyone seeing the whole thing, it looked like the Russians were carrying out a kamikaze attack. If the Soviet tanks broke through in depth, it could only result in the collapse of the German front. Fortunately for the Germans, a friend comes to the rescue. Or should I say a foe? See, yesterday, Panzer Grenadiers spent hours breaching a Soviet anti-tank ditch just behind Hill 252.2. It seems now that Soviet tankers haven't been informed about its existence, and the German troops watch in amazement as several of the lead T-34s suddenly vanish into the ditch. It is possible for the tanks to get across the ditch and come up the other side, but as they climb the slope, their guns are pointing uselessly up into the air, and they present their vulnerable undersides to the Germans. As one panzer commander puts it, they were a very easy target for our guns. The Soviet tanks following behind have to slam on the brakes to avoid the same fate. They don't have much idea of what to do next, especially as Kirichenko has not attached any sapper units to his corps. The ditch halts several dozen Soviet tanks. There is a bridge across it, which the Germans captured intact yesterday, and several T-34s make for that, but this just gives the German gunners flanking shots. The Germans breathe a sigh of relief as they continue firing. All the while, artillery fire rains down and Stukas let loose with bombs and cannon fire on the enemy, as one SS tanker will later recall. When a T-34 explodes, or its ammunition, its turret goes flying off, and a smoke ring rises into the air, just like one blown by a smoker. That's just the way it was with the T-34. Indeed, from these smoke rings one can see, there goes one T-34, there goes a second. Their losses were enormous. The Russians, if you will, fought courageously, but coordination was lacking. In principle, with such a massive armor, they should simply have crushed us. But this didn't happen. And what about Rudolf von Ribbentrop, who we left stuck at the top of the hill, surrounded by Soviet armor? Well, he and one of the other tanks from his platoon actually managed to sneak back in amongst the mass of Soviet tanks, obscured by the smoke, dust, and general confusion. They shoot as they go, destroying a few Soviet tanks with shots to the rear, and praying that their own anti-tank guns don't fire at them. Miraculously, Ribbentrop will make it out of the battle unscathed. The slaughter at the anti-tank ditch, and there really is no other word for it than slaughter, continues for about 3 hours. And this completely halts the advance of the 32nd Tank Brigade. By noon, Hill 252.2 is pretty much back under the control of the Germans, who then get a real first look at the damage inflicted on the Soviet 29th Tank Corps. By this time, the slope of the hill looked like a tank graveyard, covered with the still burning wrecks of some 100 Soviet tanks and a handful of SPWs from the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment's 3rd Battalion. The figures reported seemed so incredible that SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, the commanding general of 2nd SS Panzer Corps, drove to the front in person to see for himself. As we shall see, these recollections are backed up by the actual lost data. But as this is going on, some tanks of the 170th and 181st Tank Brigades managed to bypass the German defenses at the Oktyabrski State Farm. This is another area where the narrative gets a bit confused depending whose opinion you ask. The farm itself stays in German hands, at least for a few more hours, and plenty of Soviet tanks are held up by the defenses here. But it seems there's a big breakthrough by some 50 or 60 tanks which do manage to bypass the defenses. The German history of the war writes, at the same time as Hill 252.2 was being defended against frontal attack, the situation was becoming critical on Leibstandarte's left flank. There, Major General Bakharev's 18th Armored Corps attacked along the Psel with 170th, 181st, and 110th Armored Brigades, supported by 32nd Motorized Rifle Brigade and several unattached units, such as 25th Guards Armored Regiment, which was equipped with British Churchill tanks. This sudden thrust occurred at the most unfavorable moment for the Germans, and in the most unfavorable place, that is, right in the gap between SS Armored Infantry Divisions Leibstandarte and Totenkopf, to which we have already referred. The Soviet 18th Armored Corps penetrated deep into the gap with almost no opposition. The situation here probably isn't quite critical, though it certainly looks dangerous. Valery Zamulin takes a more pessimistic view of things from a Soviet point of view and emphasizes just how long and bloody the struggle at the farm itself was. In between these tanks and the German artillery and command posts near Komsomolets State Farm is the Leibstandarte's reconnaissance battalion. They grapple with the tanks as best they can. And bear in mind, they do have 6 75mm towed anti-tank guns. And they soon get support from Michael Wittmann's 13th Company of the Leibstandarte's Panzer Regiment. There are just 4 tanks in this company, but they are 4 of the most heavily armed and armored type of tank on the planet right now, the Panzer VI Tiger. The Tiger is armed with the 88mm L56 gun, which is capable of penetrating the frontal armor of a T-34 at very great ranges, like even 1,500 meters or more. By contrast, these T-34s cannot penetrate the front or the turret of the Tiger even at point-blank range. Remember, these are the older model of the T-34 with the 76mm gun. The T-34-85 with the 85mm gun will not come into service till next year. The Tigers are another of the mysteries of Prokhorovka. Even knowing where they are when the battle begins is far from simple. Ben Wheatley says they were on the front lines, facing off against the 18th Tank Corps from the start. There are also Soviet tankers who claim to have come under fire from Tigers while advancing on the farm. But as we've seen before, Soviet eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable at identifying Tigers, and it's normal for them to claim there are dozens of Tigers all over the battlefields of Prokhorovka. In fact, the 29th Tank Corps will claim tomorrow that it alone has destroyed 11 Tigers. Others, like Robert Forchik, say the Tigers were kept in reserve and were dispatched to meet the advancing enemy once they bypassed the farm. Historians of the battle all have different opinions on this, and they enjoy arguing with each other about it. What we do know is that Wittmann and his 4 vehicles begin engaging a far larger force of Soviet tanks from the 170th Tank Brigade in the fields between Komsomolets and Oktyabrski State Farms. Some historians, like Christopher Lawrence, have speculated that there are some other tanks here too, maybe some other non-Tiger tanks. Stugs or other SPGs also took part. Or maybe a few Totenkopf tanks crossed the Psel to help out. I don't know. There are all sorts of myths and legends that abound about this battle. Things like T-34s ramming Tigers in a desperate attempt to take them out. But really, because they have such a massive range advantage, the Tigers naturally decide to fight at arm's length. They position themselves up on the high ground of Hill 241.6, which gives them an excellent field of fire along the Soviet tankers' line of advance, and they start blasting the tanks of the 170th Brigade. When it comes to the 181st Brigade, there's a lot of conflicting information about their advance. But it does seem that they've made it to Andreevka by about noon. They will advance no further than that, and will be halted by Totenkopf's 6th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, and by some of Totenkopf's tanks, which cross the Psel later in the afternoon. Before that happens, though, some of 181st tanks head south from Andreevka towards Komsomolets State Farm, where they run into Wittmann's Tigers after the tanks of the 170th have already done so. This time around, the Tigers descend forward down the slope of the hill. This brings them closer to the enemy, and in fact, one Soviet tank driver actually does aim his burning tank at an enemy Tiger, although the German avoids the flaming Hulk pretty easily. Wittmann and his company will repulse that attack too, but the Soviets will manage to immobilize one Tiger with a well-placed shot. Overall, one wonders if the loss of a Leibstandarte Tiger tank is evidence of the cavalier tactics used by the Heavy Company's commander Michael Wittmann. The use of similar tactics would ultimately cost Wittmann his life the following year in Normandy, when on the 8th of August 1944, his no longer invulnerable Tiger tank was destroyed while charging across open terrain. But what about those tanks that managed to sneak their way through into the German rear and actually reached Komsomolets State Farm? With the lack of progress at both Oktyabrski State Farm and Hill 252.2, Rotmistrov has placed a lot of emphasis on this infiltration. Whether he's been misinformed by Kirichenko or he's deluding himself, he has convinced himself that this is a sign the 18th and 29th Corps are on the verge of breaking the Germans. By 11:15, he's ordered Popov's 2nd Tank Corps to be ready to attack from Storozhevoye to exploit this success. But these hopes are far from reality. Major Ivanov's tank battalion and his supporting motorized riflemen dig in on the farm using the abandoned German fortifications, sure, but a counterattack by the SS completely envelops them and separates them from the support of the rest of their corps. Then the Germans pound the infiltration force and the infantry advances with anti-tank weapons, supported by the Panzer Regiment, heavy airstrikes, and even from artillery pieces firing over open sights. Commander of the 32nd Tank Brigade, Colonel Liniev, tries to send his 2nd Tank Battalion as a relief force. Captain Vakulenko leads his tanks in the footsteps, or the tracks, of his comrade, tracing the same route along the railway embankment. But this time, the Germans are waiting just northeast of the farm, and Vakulenko's tanks are stopped by anti-tank guns and artillery. With that, the fate of the infiltration group is sealed. The Soviet tanks are destroyed, and the SS kill or capture pretty much all of Ivanov's men. I'll let Valery Zamulin finish the story. As the veterans of the 53rd Motorized Rifle Brigade, who survived the resulting slaughter, later remembered, the Germans practically wiped the Komsomolets State Farm from the face of the earth. Major Ivanov's group held out in an all-round defense for several hours, but they were outnumbered, and the enemy eventually destroyed all 15 tanks. Ivanov himself was killed. On the 18th of July, brother officers found his body beside his burned-out tank and committed it to the earth of the Komsomolets State Farm. That's a little bit of a spoiler. Yes, the Soviets will be back in control of the Komsomolets State Farm pretty soon, but it will not be today, and it will not be tomorrow. Finally, today at 1 p.m., elements of the 31st, 32nd, and 181st Tank Brigades break into the Oktyabrski State Farm, but they cannot take the whole thing and maintain little more than a toehold in the northern half. By 2 p.m., it is pretty clear that Rotmistrov's attack has failed, and the two corps commanders start to take their troops over to the defensive. The lack of progress at Oktyabrski State Farm, the complete failure at Hill 252.2, leaves the Soviets in a very vulnerable position, with the 18th and 29th Corps surrounded by German troops on a ring of higher ground. Any hopes of a breakthrough in the center have evaporated. Starting at dawn, 2 Soviet tank corps had thrown themselves against the Adolf Hitler SS division with parts of the Totenkopf and Das Reich SS divisions, and by the early afternoon had fallen back to their defensive positions, effectively gutted. It was an attack that went nowhere at great cost. You can pretty much summarize the entire battle along these lines. Out on the flanks, across the Psel and south of the railway line, fighting will continue on into the evening, but nothing will change the situation to the Soviet advantage. In fact, it is the Germans who will push forward now, with the Totenkopf division making a huge armored thrust north of the Psel, so don't miss the next thrilling episode. And don't miss out on being a part of this adventure. Join the TimeGhost Army today at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. It is the Army that is responsible for our existence. Neil McGettigan is the TimeGhost Army Prokhorovka pal this week, and these are the newest Army officers. And do not forget to subscribe either. See you next time.